BC Premier David Eby reacted to the Stellantis news with this, writing that awful news for Stellantis workers in Ontario, and Ottawa is responding as they should. We need that same urgent response for our forestry workers in British Columbia. Eby also made that argument for federal help for the forestry sector yesterday.
When people who work to build those auto parts, when steel workers in Ontario, when their jobs are in trouble, when their jobs are threatened, it's treated as a national emergency, and rightly so. And what we're asking for today is that same respect, that same concern, that same sense of emergency is shared for the forest sector in this country. Because Ottawa is in Ontario, because it's beside Quebec, those provinces are often front of mind. And so my anxiety as a British Columbian, as a Western Premier, is that we have to be way more aggressive to make sure that we get our message heard.
Well, those aren't the only tariffs putting a strain on Team Canada's unity. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, he's at odds with two Western premiers over Canadian tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
I get why Wab Kinew and Scott are saying, you know, drop the tariffs, but I have to do the same thing, and I respect their sector. They ship about 4.9 billion to China on canola. Well, look at our auto sectors. I respect what they're doing, but there's no damn way we should drop tariffs on China. I'll tell you that.
Okay, so Amanda, this is good. You know, these tariffs are hitting all the fault lines of the economy, all the fault lines of regionalism, right? Because, you know, you've got fish products out on the East Coast, where I'm from, getting hammered as a result of the EV stuff as well. And you drop one to solve the other, it just creates problems in another direction. What do you make of this, that the Team Canada approach that was there? I don't know. It seems to get a little bit less unified every week.
Yeah, this is entirely, I think, predictable. This is the nature of the Federation, right? That each premier will be at the table as part of the Federation and part of Team Canada. But when push comes to shove, they represent the residents of their own provinces and the interests and sectors of those provinces. And they need to be seen to not just be Team Canada, but to be Team Ontario or Team Saskatchewan or Team BC. And the sector that's most specifically involved in this tariff war, in this trade war, is the one in which they're going to be seen as standing up for the interests of that province. So whether it's canola or whether it's auto or whether it's energy or whether it's forestry, I think we're going to hear more and more from the premiers as they start to refine their message around those sectors to show that they're standing up for workers and they're standing up for their province. So this is not unexpected, and I don't think it really takes away from Team Canada. To be honest, at the end of the day, we need all of these sectors to thrive. These are all a part of the deal. I think that's why we heard from the minister today that it's not just steel and aluminum and energy that they're discussing at the table, that they're also talking about auto, and he mentioned forestry today. So right. I think that, you know, we're starting to hear they're trying to make those connections to the provinces as well. They're not just speaking to Canadians, they're speaking specifically to those who are most affected by those key sectors.
But, you know, each one of these moves, Tim, it magnifies the pressure points in the economy and the pressure points in the country, right? That if you have the prairie, you know, agriculture-based economies, you know, pushing back saying we are being sacrificed for the auto sector in Ontario, and David Eby saying my forestry workers are being sacrificed for this. Boy, oh boy, because they're all going to get their domestic political and economic pressure, and it's all going to filter up to the PMO.
Yeah, and going after the PM is not going to solve the problem here. I mean, they almost all need to co-opt an approach not unlike, not Doug Ford at the Empire Club answering Ben Mulroney's questions, but in terms of direct getting in your face stuff. I think Jordan said it earlier. You know, our ad, the Ontario ad, is very Canadian, but we're not talking to normal Americans, and we're Canadians talking to Canadians. We're doing it in a civilized manner. We need to find ways to get into the headspace of the president and to mess around with his norms. You know, that's getting on the Foxes, it's getting on the different channels in the U.S., maybe using different spokespeople to be aggressive and to speak to Americans as Donald Trump speaks to Americans. I mean, an interesting political play here would be to see if, Pierre Poilievre says he wants to be co-opted into it. Get Pierre Poilievre co-opted in, doing something, talking to Americans that way. Challenge him if you're the Prime Minister to do that. But we need to think out of the box. I mean, David Eby's right to be angry. Doug Ford's right to be angry. So's Wab Kinew. But being angry with each other is going to get you nowhere here. Start looking south.
But then, Jordan, you can see the challenge, right? That if you're making a king-size bed with queen-size sheets. You know, you move it to solve one problem, you cause a problem in another area. So you drop the EV tariffs, for example, with China to help canola, but then you sacrifice your auto sector. So if you're not willing to make those trade-offs, then you end up having to spend a lot of money to keep everybody kind of whole, which then sort of erodes the financial position of the government as the economic position continues to get battered, and it creates just a weaker foundation for you to stare down Donald Trump in this whole trade war, right? There's the potential for a real negative cycle in all of this.
Well, to be clear, I think the government's financial position is not good to start with, right?
No, but it can get worse, is the thing, right?
But an important part of that is that there has always been an understanding that there is going to be a need for some sort of national burden sharing here on impacted industries. And I think we've lost sight a little bit of that. But that was early on. That was a really important part of the conversations. But equally important was that was going to be funded through counter-tariff revenue. But we no longer have any counter-tariffs that are bringing in revenue to fund things like that. So that's another problem for the government. Look, it's very clear that the American strategy here is to divide and conquer. They have figured out which industries that they would like to continue to have involvement with in Canada, and they are prioritizing those in the talks. And the Carney government has decided to engage in that sector-by-sector side agreement approach. And I can understand why, because they're trying to protect CUSMA, they're trying to protect and maybe play for time on that whole agreement. But unfortunately, what that means is that as perhaps they begin to reach agreements on some of these key sectors, there are going to be winners and losers. And what is dangerous and potentially toxic around that is if that burden sharing doesn't happen here in Canada. If there isn't a sense that those workers are being protected and taken care of all across the country in an even-handed way, that's where the government can really get into trouble. And look, we've seen already, they've been out there and they were prepared to put forward, for example, special support measures for workers impacted by the steel and aluminum tariffs. Yeah. There has not been that support for forestry workers. There has not been that support for auto workers. So there's a lot more that the government could be concretely doing. But they also could be looking at ways to push back on the United States. And while it's true that some opposition to Trump's measures, some things like counter tariffs could provoke him, we also don't really know, right? Because we haven't been doing that. We haven't tried that. And so I think to Tim's point, this is about thinking outside of the box, but it's about thinking outside of the box as well in terms of the constraints that the government has put on itself about how to push back.
But you know, Sherelle, Jordan's point on burden sharing brings me back to kind of the topic we were talking about earlier with information sharing. Like Wab Kinew on the show said, what did we get for dropping the counter tariffs? I don't know. Yeah. Doug Ford saying, if he knows something we don't, he should talk to the premiers. Now, Doug Ford says him and Mark Carney are going to meet tomorrow. We haven't gotten that from the Prime Minister yet, but I don't think Doug Ford is lying. You know, it gets easier to hold people together for burden sharing when there is some information sharing, and that just does not seem to be the thing right now.
Yeah, it's like everybody's looking to each other and going, have you heard something? Have you heard something? And, oh, what are they telling you? Why haven't they told me this? And to Jordan's point as well, like the fact that financially things don't seem equally shared across the board, that's going to cause some rifts. And so when they see people getting what may look like people getting cozier, Ottawa's in Ontario and it's next door to Quebec, so they are getting the lion's share of not only the money but also the information and the FaceTime and things like that. That's going to cause people to get their backs up. You look at like the softwood lumber industry; it's been under the gun for a very long time. Even, and if it wasn't the deal with the U.S. that fell apart, is the mountain pine beetle that was devastating the trees, and the mills have been devastated for a long time. So people have been waiting a very long time for some sort of support, and to now see additional support being given to other industries and not knowing and not hearing and just waiting, I think that's going to be a bigger issue. So yes, there needs to be a broadening of the circle at the very least to just make people feel as though they're involved in the process. Yeah,
we're going to talk to BC Forest Minister Ravi Parmar coming up in just a little bit on the show, because obviously they have some deep concerns about what's happening with that industry. But Amanda, I don't know if David Eby is going to get a meeting with Mark Carney anytime soon. Doug Ford seems to get a lot of FaceTime with the Prime Minister, assuming he's correct on his itinerary tomorrow. I mean, What do you think will come of that? Is this the sort of meeting where Mark Carney's got to go in and try to get Doug Ford to calm it down a little bit, or what do you think is the play there for the Prime Minister with the increasingly restless First Minister of Ontario?
Well, listen, we've seen, if you look, historically over the last number of months at how Doug Ford has operated with the feds, it's been mostly pretty chummy, right? There have been a lot of kind of cohesive communications between the province and the feds. He's definitely stood up as that kind of Team Canada spokesperson. And I think that he seems to be the type of premier, at least at this stage, who, if he does get the face time and does get some of the answers that he's seeking, seems to fall in line from a communication standpoint. So I wouldn't be surprised if coming out of the meeting with Prime Minister Carney, if that does happen tomorrow, that he shares probably some conciliatory type words around that meeting. May not happen, but that seems to be the trend when we watch what happens with Ford when he ends up meeting with the feds.
Tim, what do you think comes out of this tomorrow?
You're probably still an addled Doug Ford, but perhaps he will be empowered by the Prime Minister to share some things and do some others. But you know what I'd like to see, David, is where is the Brian Tobin of our era? Meaning when the former Premier of Newfoundland, who was a cabinet minister, when the referendum challenge was in place, he and others led a massive rally. They thought out of the box when overfishing was at play and Canada was not being heard and we were in a global conflict around that. We fired on some Spanish vessels and we brought a tiny turbot to the UN. The point being, we do need that kind of showmanship in the United States to make a point to Trump. I know I keep going back here, but premiers and prime ministers meeting with each other and saying, oh yeah, we got it handled, is not going to move Donald Trump. Something in the U.S. will.
Yeah, I'm looking. There's key sectors and key players and key stakeholders who need to see some progress, right? They need to see something because it just keeps being an erosion of the overall financial and economic health of the country with not a lot of clarity and not a lot of hope at this point in time. I'm going to have to give this Newfoundlander the last word because we've got another Newfoundlander coming up. The Premier Designate, Tony Wakeham, is standing by to join us. So I'm going to say goodbye to the Power Panel. Thank you all. Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, Jordan Leiknitz, and Sherelle Evelyn.